For years, my life felt steady, almost like a well-worn path I could walk with my eyes closed. My wife and I had been together for over 2 decades, building a home that was filled with the kind of small, ordinary joys people often take for granted. Sunday mornings meant pancakes at the kitchen table, with sunlight spilling across her coffee cup. We would talk about our week, about the garden, or sometimes just sit in comfortable silence. We weren't rich, but we had enough. Enough to pay the bills, enough to take a trip every now and then, enough to plan for a quiet, secure retirement. We had shared dreams, growing old together, spoiling future grandkids, maybe buying that little cabin by the lake we always talked about. She was my anchor. The person I trusted with my fears, my hopes, my heart. I believed she felt the same about me. Our life wasn't perfect, no marriage is, but there was a foundation of trust and love that I thought could withstand anything. I didn't know then that a single decision, a single moment, would shake that foundation until it cracked. At the time, all I saw was the warmth of our home, the comfort of her presence, and the quiet certainty that tomorrow would look a lot like today. It started innocently enough, or at least, that's how it seemed to me. One evening, she came home with a folded flyer in her hand, a soft smile on her face. "Mary invited me to a service at her church this Sunday," she said, almost casually, as if she were mentioning a lunch date or a trip to the grocery store. I didn't think much of it. My wife had always been friendly, open to new experiences. Over the years, we'd attended different churches, sometimes just to visit, sometimes to see old friends. This seemed no different. She explained that Mary had been talking about how welcoming the congregation was, how powerful the pastor's sermons could be. That Sunday morning, she dressed with unusual care, choosing a dress I hadn't seen her wear in years. There was a spark in her eyes, an energy that made me happy for her. I figured maybe she needed this, something uplifting, something to refresh her spirit. When she came home later that afternoon, there was a lightness in her voice as she told me about the service. She spoke about the music, the way the congregation sang as if every note was a prayer. But most of all, she spoke about the pastor, how his words felt like they were meant just for her. I remember smiling, thinking it was good for her to feel inspired. I had no idea that this new church would soon become the center of her world, and the beginning of my world slowly coming apart. At first, they were so small I barely noticed them. She started humming hymns while she cooked dinner, ones I didn't recognize. Our evening talks shifted ever so slightly, from the day's events or our plans for the weekend, to little snippets about the pastor's message or a story someone from the congregation had shared. She began attending Wednesday night Bible study. "It's just for an hour or so," she'd say, brushing off my raised eyebrow. And when I asked if she wanted me to come along, she'd smile politely and say, "Maybe another time." The changes weren't just in her schedule, they were in her tone, her priorities. She seemed more preoccupied. Conversations that once felt warm and familiar sometimes ended with her quoting something the pastor had said, as if his words carried more weight than mine. There was also a new seriousness in her prayers at the dinner table. They became longer, more emotional, almost as if she were talking to someone she knew personally. I told myself it was just a phase, that she'd come back to the rhythm we'd always had. But deep down, a quiet unease began to stir. I didn't know it then, but those little shifts were the first cracks in the life we had built together. One Sunday morning, she leaned over her coffee and said, "Why don't you come with me today? You can see what I've been talking about." Her voice was light, but there was an eagerness in her eyes I couldn't ignore. I agreed, partly out of curiosity, partly because I missed being part of whatever was capturing her heart. We drove together, the car filled with the smell of her perfume, one I hadn't noticed her wearing in years. The church was smaller than I expected, tucked between a hardware store and a row of old brick buildings. Inside, the air was warm, filled with the mingling scent of candles and fresh coffee. People greeted us with smiles that felt genuine, shaking my hand like I was already one of them. The service began with music, loud, passionate, and raw. I could see how it might move someone. And then the pastor stepped forward. His presence was magnetic, his voice steady and confident, his eyes sweeping over the congregation as though he knew each person's private burdens. I remember feeling something I couldn't name, an odd mix of admiration and caution. The way my wife looked at him, leaning in to catch every word, stirred something uneasy in me. Still, I told myself it was harmless. If only I had trusted that first ripple of doubt. From the moment he began to speak, it was clear why people were drawn to him. His voice carried the kind of authority that made you want to believe every word. He didn't just preach, he painted pictures with his sentences, weaving stories that felt personal, almost intimate. He walked slowly across the small stage, never standing still for too long, his gaze locking onto different faces as if he was speaking directly to each one. And when his eyes met mine, there was a subtle nod, like he already knew me, or wanted me to think he did. My wife was transfixed. I watched her lips move silently, repeating parts of his message under her breath, her eyes glistening as if the weight of the world had just been lifted from her shoulders. She hung on every pause, every change in his tone. After the service, he made a point to greet us. His handshake was firm, his smile warm, but there was something else in his eyes, something hard to define. He complimented my wife on her open heart and told her God had special plans for her. I left the church that day with a strange knot in my stomach. I didn't know if it was jealousy, mistrust, or something deeper, a quiet warning my mind couldn't yet put into words. It didn't happen overnight. At first, it was just small moments that seemed insignificant until they weren't. We used to talk about everything, our day, our plans, the little absurdities of life that only we found funny. But lately, when I asked about her day, her answers were shorter. Her eyes would drift away, like her mind was somewhere else. She started spending more time at the church, volunteering for events, helping organize gatherings, staying late after services. When she came home, she would tell me about the pastor's latest sermon or the amazing conversations she'd had with people from the congregation. But the way she talked about those moments, it was different. Like she was describing a world I didn't belong to. I tried to be understanding, thinking maybe she was just caught up in the excitement of something new. But then, I noticed she stopped asking about my day altogether. Our evening meals became quieter. The laughter that used to fill the kitchen was replaced by long stretches of silence, broken only by the clink of silverware. It was as if an invisible wall had begun to rise between us, brick by brick, while I stood on one side, watching her slowly step away to the other. It was a Sunday afternoon, warm and bright outside, but inside the church the air felt heavy. The service had ended, and people were slowly making their way toward the doors. I was gathering our things when I noticed my wife wasn't beside me. I scanned the small sanctuary until I saw her, standing near the front, speaking quietly with the pastor. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, his face close to hers as if sharing a secret. Then, without a word to me, they both stepped into a side room. I waited, telling myself it was nothing unusual. Maybe she just needed some personal prayer, maybe she was seeking guidance. But as the minutes ticked by, unease curled tighter in my stomach. When they finally emerged, her eyes were red, and she was holding a folded piece of paper in her hand. She didn't meet my gaze. The pastor smiled politely at me, said something about God working in mysterious ways, and walked off. On the drive home, I asked her what they talked about. She hesitated, then simply said, "He prayed for me." That's all. Her tone was final, like a door quietly closing. I didn't push further, but that moment, the way she avoided my eyes, stayed with me. And somewhere deep inside, I knew something had shifted. That evening, the house felt different. It wasn't just quiet, it was the kind of silence that presses in, making you aware of every sound, every breath. She moved through the room slowly, almost as if she were avoiding me. At dinner, she barely spoke. Her answers were short, her fork scraping softly against the plate. I tried to start a conversation, asking about her week, about plans for the garden, but each question seemed to float between us and then disappear, unanswered. Later, when we went to bed, she turned to her side almost immediately, her back to me. Normally, I'd reach out, rest my hand on her shoulder, and she'd take it, holding my fingers until we drifted to sleep. That night, I hesitated. Something told me she didn't want my touch. In the darkness, I stared at the ceiling, my mind replaying the scene from earlier, the closed door, the pastor's hand on her shoulder, the red in her eyes. Every little detail seemed sharper, more deliberate. She fell asleep quickly, or at least pretended to. I lay awake for hours, the weight of that silence pressing down, sensing that a change had taken root, and that nothing would ever feel quite the same again. The next morning felt colder than usual, even though the sun was spilling through the kitchen window. She was already up when I came downstairs, standing at the counter with her coffee, staring out at the backyard. "Morning," I said softly. She glanced at me, offered a faint smile, and went back to her cup. There was no hug, no casual brush of her hand against mine like there used to be. I poured my coffee and sat at the table, waiting for her to join me. Instead, she stayed where she was, leaning against the counter as if the distance between us was intentional. I tried to fill the space with light conversation, mentioning the weather, the grocery list, a neighbor's new car, but she responded with polite, clipped sentences, as if each word cost her something. Her phone buzzed on the counter, and she picked it up quickly. I caught a glimpse of the screen, a short message, but she angled it away before I could read it. She smiled faintly at whatever it said, then set the phone down and took another sip of coffee. There was something in her posture, in the way she avoided my eyes, that told me she was carrying a decision. I just didn't know yet that it would be the one to shatter our life together. It happened with no warning, or maybe the warning signs had been there all along, and I just refused to see them. She set her coffee down, took a deep breath, and finally turned to face me. Her voice was calm, almost too calm. "I've been thinking a lot," she began, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. "And I don't think I can do this anymore." I frowned, not understanding. "Do what?" "This marriage," she said, her eyes locking onto mine. "I want a divorce." The words didn't feel real at first. They just hung in the air, sharp and cold, like shards of glass suspended between us. I laughed, a nervous, shaky sound. "That's not funny." "I'm not joking," she said quietly. Her tone wasn't angry or emotional, it was final, like a door being shut with a quiet click. I searched her face for some sign of hesitation, some crack where I could slip in a plea or a question. But her expression was steady, almost relieved. Somewhere inside, my chest tightened, my breath catching as the reality sank in. I didn't know it then, but that moment would replay in my mind for years, always with the same hollow echo: I want a divorce. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at her, waiting for the punchline that never came. My mind scrambled to rewrite her words into something less final. Maybe she was angry, maybe she needed space, maybe this was just one of those marital storms we'd weathered before. I told her she was tired, stressed, maybe under too much influence from this new church and its pastor. I reminded her of our years together, the life we'd built, the promises we'd made. My voice was steady at first, but I could feel the cracks forming. She didn't argue. She just listened, nodding occasionally, as if she'd already had this conversation in her head 100 times and knew exactly how it ended. When I reached for her hand, she pulled it back gently, like someone stepping away from a ledge. That small gesture hurt more than the words. I told myself it wasn't real, that this was a momentary break in reason, that given a day, or a week, she'd come back to herself. But deep down, under all the denial, a cold truth was beginning to take root: she was already gone. When I finally asked her why, she took a long breath, as if choosing her words carefully. "This isn't about anger," she said softly. "It's about clarity. I've been praying, and I believe God is showing me a new path. One where I can truly serve Him, without distractions." "Distractions?" I repeated, the word catching in my throat. She nodded, her eyes steady. "I've realized that our lives have been comfortable, but not truly purposeful. I want to live in full obedience, and I feel called to something different now." I pressed her. Was this about the pastor, the church, something I'd done? She shook her head, almost pitying me for not understanding. "It's bigger than that," she insisted. "It's about my soul, my eternity. The way she spoke was unsettling, almost rehearsed, as if she were repeating a lesson learned word for word. There was no room for debate, no opening for me to change her mind. It wasn't just that she wanted to leave, it was that she believed it was holy to do so. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't just losing my wife. I was losing her to something I couldn't fight. In the days that followed, I reached out to the people who knew us best, hoping someone could talk sense into her, or at least help me understand what was happening. My oldest friend, Mark, listened quietly as I explained everything. When I mentioned the church and the pastor, his jaw tightened. "Be careful," he warned. "Some of these guys know exactly how to get into people's heads." I called her sister, thinking maybe she could reason with her. But instead, I got a cold, rehearsed response. "If this is what she feels God is calling her to, you should respect it." It felt like she was reading from the same script my wife had been using. Even my mother, who had always been gentle and slow to judge, struggled for words. "Son," she said carefully, "I think she's made up her mind." "I'm sorry." The more I tried to rally support, the more I realized how isolated I was becoming. Friends who had once been quick to invite us over now avoided the conversation. Family members spoke in cautious tones, as if afraid of taking sides. It was like the life we had built together was vanishing, not just in our home, but in the minds of everyone around us. I decided I couldn't just sit back and watch my marriage dissolve without at least speaking to the man at the center of it all. One Wednesday evening, after their Bible study had ended, I waited outside the church. When he finally emerged, he seemed almost unsurprised to see me. "Brother," he said warmly, as if we were old friends. "What can I do for you?" I told him plainly that my wife had asked for a divorce, and that ever since she'd started attending his church, everything about her had changed. My voice was tight, but I kept it steady. I wanted answers. He listened with a calm expression, nodding occasionally. Then he said, "Sometimes, God calls people to walk a different road. It's not for us to resist His will." His words were like smoke, soft, impossible to grab, slipping through my fingers before I could form a reply. I told him I believed marriage was sacred, that it was something worth fighting for. He smiled gently, almost pitying me, and said, "Marriage is sacred, yes, but so is obedience to the Lord." In that moment, I understood something chilling. I wasn't going to win this battle by appealing to reason or love. Because in his eyes, and now in hers, I wasn't the enemy of our marriage. I was the obstacle to her calling. I tried pressing him, asking directly if he had advised her to leave me, if he had told her this was God's plan. His expression never changed. "I only speak the truth of Scripture," he said smoothly. "People choose how to respond to it." I asked if he thought it was right for a pastor to get between a husband and wife. He tilted his head slightly, as if the question itself was naive. "I don't get between anyone. I simply help them see what God might be saying." Every time I asked something direct, he would circle back to vague statements about God's purpose and spiritual growth. It was like trying to hold water in my hands. No matter how I shaped my fingers, it all slipped away. At one point, I even asked him outright, "Do you believe God wants my marriage to end?" He paused for a long moment, then said, "I believe God wants your wife to follow Him with her whole heart. Sometimes, that requires sacrifice." It was clear he wasn't going to admit to anything, and maybe he didn't have to. The seeds had already been planted, and he knew it. When I left that night, I realized I hadn't gotten a single straight answer. But I had walked away with something else, a sinking certainty that this man knew exactly what he was doing. After that meeting, my mind became a battlefield. Part of me burned with anger, at the pastor, at the church, even at my wife for letting someone else's voice outweigh years of shared life. But another part of me was drowning in sadness, unable to accept that this was truly happening. Nights were the worst. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation we'd had in the past few months, looking for the exact moment when I lost her. I'd remember the early days of our marriage, our first tiny apartment, the way we'd fall asleep talking about the future, and then see the cold distance in her eyes now. I wrestled with questions I couldn't answer. Was this my fault? Had I failed her in ways I never saw? Or had she simply found something, or someone, she believed was worth more than the life we'd built together? Some mornings, I'd wake up ready to fight for her. Other mornings, I'd feel too hollow to even try. The emotional swing was exhausting, hope one day, despair the next. Through it all, I carried a quiet ache that never left. It wasn't just about losing her. It was about losing the version of myself that existed when I still believed she'd be by my side forever. It happened a few weeks after she'd told me she wanted the divorce. I came home from work to find the house unusually quiet. No smell of dinner, no sound of music from the kitchen, no light in the living room. Her car was gone. On the table sat a short note in her handwriting. I'm staying at Mary's for a while. Please don't call tonight. I stood there for a long time, holding that piece of paper, feeling the weight of its few, cold words. The house seemed bigger without her, every room echoing with a silence that made the air feel heavy. I tried turning on the TV for background noise, but even that felt wrong. I ended up sitting at the edge of our bed, staring at the empty space where her pillow used to be. That night, I ate nothing. I didn't sleep. I just sat there, thinking about how quickly life can unravel, how one day you're sharing morning coffee with the person you love, and the next you're left talking to walls. It was in that moment, more than any other, that I realized she wasn't coming back. And the kind of loneliness that settles in when you know someone has chosen to live without you, it's unlike anything else. In the quiet that followed, I found myself questioning everything I thought I understood about faith, loyalty, and the people we allow into our hearts. I had always believed that trust was built slowly, brick by brick, over years of shared struggles and triumphs. But now I saw how quickly it could be dismantled, sometimes not by betrayal in the usual sense, but by conviction. I thought about the vows we had taken in front of God, how we had promised to stand together through every storm. And yet, somewhere along the way, another voice had convinced her that leaving me was not only acceptable, but righteous. It made me realize something I wish I had understood sooner. Faith is powerful, but it is also vulnerable. When placed in the wrong hands, it can be shaped and twisted until it serves someone else's purpose. I wrestled with bitterness toward the church, toward the pastor, even toward God himself. But I also knew that if I let that bitterness take root, it would consume what little I had left. Trust, I learned, is not just about believing in others, it's about guarding your own heart, so it can't be so easily led away. Starting over didn't happen in some grand, dramatic moment. It began in small, almost invisible steps. Washing the dishes without expecting her to come dry them. Rearranging the living room furniture because it no longer needed to stay how she liked it. Cooking a meal just for myself and learning to enjoy the quiet while I ate. I began walking in the evenings, not to clear my head, because that wasn't possible yet, but to keep from drowning in the stillness of the house. The fresh air, the sound of my own footsteps, the fading light, they became my company. Friends I hadn't spoken to in years started calling, checking in. Some conversations were awkward at first, but slowly, I began to remember what it felt like to laugh without forcing it. It wasn't a smooth path. There were nights I broke down, mornings I didn't want to get out of bed. But little by little, the days stopped being about what I had lost and began to be about what I could still build. I didn't know exactly where my life was heading, but I knew one thing for sure, I was still here. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. If you've listened this far, you know this isn't just my story, it's a warning, and maybe even a lifeline for someone who's starting to see the same signs in their own life. I've learned that trust, once broken, can take years to rebuild, if it's even possible at all. I've learned that faith should bring people closer, not drive them apart. And I've learned that sometimes, the hardest thing you'll ever do is accept that the person you loved is no longer the person standing in front of you. If you're going through something similar, I want you to hear this, you will survive. The nights will feel endless, the silence will feel unbearable, but slowly, life will return. You'll laugh again. You'll find new reasons to wake up in the morning. And one day, you'll realize you've stopped looking back. I'm not telling this story for pity. I'm telling it because I hope it helps someone else see what I couldn't see soon enough. If my story touched you in any way, Please take a moment to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. Your support not only helps me keep telling these stories, it might also help someone else find the strength they need to face their own storm.